This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Lunch Show with me, Samuel Lickis, where today I will be talking to Ben Hobbis about classroom observations. What should trainees be looking out for when observing other teachers? How should experienced teachers give feedback? How can we mutually benefit from one another's experiences? Send me your questions and get the answers today on Teachers Talk Radio.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
I have to admit this week has been quite hard. It's been a significant ramp up in difficulty for me as I've got my full timetable now and I've taken over some tricky classes. And I came back home on Thursday evening having taught an absolutely awful lesson, period 6. And the whole thing felt like a complete disaster. And it was especially because of the behaviour side of things. But I spoke to my mentor afterwards and he reassured me that there were lots of good things to comment on, that... And, you know, that he even said that my behaviour management was quite good. And one of the things he said to me was that my most challenging classes were the ones that would teach me the most and help me grow most as a teacher. And I think one of the massive challenges as a trainee teacher is that you're kept under this microscope. We're there to learn, and in order to learn, we need to listen to the feedback given to us by other teachers. And that's really useful, of course. But however, it can sometimes feel like we're being appraised every second of every day. And after a full day or a full week of lessons, that can be quite draining, especially if trainees are constantly hearing that things aren't necessarily going well, or even if it doesn't feel like it's going well. So to just discuss things, all things observations, I'm really excited to introduce my guest for today, Ben Hobbis. Ben wears many hats as a primary school teacher, middle leader, deputy safeguarding lead, and he is also a student mentor who founded the EdConnect and Step Up networks for early career teachers and those looking to make the move into leadership roles. Ben, I really appreciate you joining me this week. How has your week been?
Thank you so much for having me. It's been quite good. I think the school lurgy has caught me a little bit, so I do apologise if I cough or anything at all. But no, it's been a very positive week.
No, I can fully appreciate the school lurgy. I've just noticed I've got a bit of a twang in my throat as well. And I was at university yesterday, and some of the other trainees all constantly having to sneeze and like, stay away from me because I don't want your cold. But yeah, it's the germ factory, isn't it, in schools?
Yeah,
do you have any
you do build up a good immune system. You've got to give yourself that.
Do you have any sort of top tips for trying, especially you working in a primary school? I can imagine it's especially challenging trying to just sort of keep yourself good and healthy. Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, primary school children don't really know much about personal space, especially the younger ones. I think sometimes it's just about making sure that you're well hydrated and get yourself out, even when you're not feeling ill, like, do things for you and to keep yourself well and eat well and remember to eat and to go to the toilet, all those things that tend to be things that teachers don't do.
I think I quite often completely forget rather to drink any water during the day. And I bring my water bottle, but because I'm constantly moving between classrooms, it just ends up staying in the office and I forget about it. And then I get to the end of the day and my voice sounds like sandpaper because I'm so dehydrated. But I do need to remember to drink more, I think. And that's and not try and be a camel and just take it all in all at once because it's just going to, that's not good either. Good tips. I think one of the things that I'm trying to sort of keep in mind when I'm as a trainee teacher and that I'm being observed in every lesson that I'm teaching is that so are our students. They are also being observed all day, every day by lots of different teachers. And we have that responsibility to teach them, monitor their progress, help them grow as people. So I think in that sense, being a trainee is good for developing that empathy with students. And I've been thinking about that difficult class that I had, period 6, on Thursday. And I appreciate that for many of the students there, they would have been really tired, cognitively overloaded, and perhaps even beyond the point of caring. So for you as an experienced teacher, how would you approach that, particularly if those afternoon lessons, those towards the end of the week, especially if it's really hot or really wet or something like that, when students just don't want to be there?
Yeah, I suppose that it's an interesting question because obviously in a primary school setting, in the afternoons in particular, we tend to teach the wider curriculum beyond the core subjects, and we'll do things that are probably a bit more practical for some children who can't access the core subjects as well as those who can. Some of them thrive in the afternoons. Whereas I suppose if you're a secondary or beyond, you're teaching the same subject. And, I remember when I was in year 7 at secondary school, well over 10 years ago now, that my last lesson in year 7 on period 5 on a Friday was maths. And I didn't really like maths when I was at school. And it was my worst nightmare to finish my Friday afternoon off with maths. I think it's just making sure you account for that in your planning, and making sure that you're you give yourself the leeway in those lessons. So you probably don't you should never overload a lesson anyway with lots of activities, like you said, because of cognitive overload and things like that. But we probably want to make sure that our students and children have all that taken into account, but it still means that your expectations are just as high as they are for the rest of the week, and not just thinking, because it's Friday afternoon, I'm not going to get much done, so I'll just let things go, kind of thing. It's really important that we maintain those high expectations throughout as well, and just to make it fun, and that they look forward to those lessons as well. I think it's really important.
No, I think that's really good advice, and it's saying, we can anticipate that in the afternoon, end of the week, when sort of tiredness and starts settling in, that will have an impact, but we can accommodate for that, thinking about how we're going to plan the lesson, how we're going to structure that lesson to sort of ameliorate or perhaps mitigate some of that effect, and still maintain those high expectations that we need to have, and actually that teachers need to have for themselves as well, because we can't we can't take our foot off the gas just because it's a Friday. Or every hour of learning in the school day is valuable and just as important as each other, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Totally agree.
So I think for many trainees at this point in the year, they'll be perhaps doing some starters or some plenaries, perhaps co-teaching a lesson with their mentor or other teachers. Some may be doing full lessons, and some may still just be observing. So perhaps at different stages, but doing a combination of some teaching and observing. So I think just to start us off for today, if you're observing a lesson as a trainee teacher at this time of the year, sort of still in September, beginning of October, what should trainees be looking out for?
I think at the moment, and like we're finding this in sort of my school at the moment, is even though we're 4 weeks in, next week will be week 5, I know it might be a bit longer for others, but teachers are still setting routines up and still developing relationships with children with classes. So you might find that as a trainee teacher, if you're now in school already, that some of your teachers might be struggling with some routines or some relationships or some behaviours, and they'll be quite honest with that. And actually, I think one of the things that trainees definitely should do when they're training alongside a teacher is watch the teacher and watch what strategies work really well for that class. What do the class really respond to, or classes respond to? And then duplicate that, because that's what the children are used to, rather than having another individual with brand new ideas. In some cases, you might need to implement some things that you want in your lessons, and that's absolutely fine, because you should also have a bit of flexibility and autonomy as well as a trainee. It's also about giving the children that consistency, and sometimes consistency is just mirroring the teacher. So, for example, like in my very first training placement, the way I would stop a class to get their attention was in the exact same way as the class teacher, so that the children knew that I expected what he expected, and it was exactly the same. And I've done that sort of throughout my teacher training. Then when you get your own class, or classes, it's very different then, because you set that precedence of what your expectations are, and looking at how the teachers introduce that. So like one of the things I think is really beneficial, which I didn't have when I was training, which I've used since I've qualified, are the walkthroughs books, and particularly the first walkthroughs book. So the one with the yellow cover, it really teaches you how to introduce routines and relationships with classes, and with children. So I think that's something that that training should be looking at now. There might be some things that teachers try, like the teachers you're alongside, your mentors, that doesn't work, and they might even admit to that. And so that's where you can be quite. You can be then creative and you do your own thing, if you like, but try things out that work. And if it doesn't work, doesn't matter, try something else.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, that's it. So it's a good book recommendation there, and I think perhaps actually looking for a book that suits you, whether it's that one or some other book that sort of talks about those sorts of things, perhaps giving a sort of checklist that you can go through to think about, has the teacher done this, that, or the other. I really like that you mentioned, sort of adopting the same sort of routines as the teachers got, particularly for younger year groups, whether it's in Key Stage 3 or in primary school. Having a new teacher just sort of airdropped into the lesson all of a sudden can be quite. It's going to be a big transition for them, isn't it? And I think actually trying to make it as smooth for those students as possible is really important for both you as a trainee teacher, or me as a trainee teacher, being able to get the most out of those students, but also for the students to actually warm up to me as well and just help to develop those relationships, because they don't see me as some scary new individual who's just going to try all these funky new things on day one, but actually has that continuity with their teacher that they already know.
Yeah, I agree. Totally agree. And I mean, I mentored a student last year with my class, and they started quite early with me. They were like a third year university student on a primary education program, and they started like at the very beginning of October. It might have even been the end of September. And the class I'd actually taught before. So I taught them when I first started at the school just after lockdown. So I knew them fairly well. But obviously they'd had another teacher for a year, and I had a different style to that teacher, and so I needed to rebuild that relationship of routines. And in the class as well, because there was a high level of pupil premium and ascend, we also had a supply teacher who used to help in the mornings, and we'd split the class down. So they knew me, they were getting used to this other supply teacher, and then I had a student teacher as well. And they actually struggled quite a bit in terms of having potentially 3 different people, and then throw the teaching assistant in 4 different people that they're trying to get to know. And whilst we would all mirror the same expectations, it's all a little bit different. And you'll find that with children that it shouldn't be the case, but in some cases, children might have a different level of relationship and maybe to a certain extent respect for their class teacher or their form tutor, or a teacher they know really well, or a senior member of staff, than they do with other members of staff as well. And so that's something that is also, which at a secondary level is something to consider if, a student has, been taught by 5 different individuals in one day, and then also had a tutorial period by another person. That's 6 different adults they're interacting with, who, whilst they'll implement like the same behaviour policies and the same practices across a school, probably all have their own unique style. And so it can be quite a lot for children and quite overwhelming. So it's about how can we do that to the point where it's consistent but effective, but also allows each teacher to have their own bit of autonomy as well.
Ben, thank you for all that. That's all really good. We're going to pick up some of those points just after our break for the news.
Teaching is a rewarding profession, but it comes with its fair share of challenges. That's where ADAPT come in. We're not your typical trade union, but instead a modern, apolitical alternative, offering expert legal, employment and mental health support. Protection without the politics. So what makes ADAPT different? We're always apolitical and independent, specialised solely in supporting individual teachers. Our caseworkers are professionally qualified, ensuring you always get the best advice. Plus, there's 24/7 mental health support. Whether it's a simple contract check or handling serious allegations, EDAPT are here for you. Join the thousands of educators who've chosen EDAPT to protect their careers. Subscribe at edapt.org.uk today. EDAPT, supporting school staff, protecting careers.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The BBC covers reports that Labour has dropped plans to end charitable status for private schools. The status exempts some private schools in England and Wales from taxes. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, had previously said charitable status for private schools could not be justified. The party said it will still remove other tax breaks if it wins the next general election. There are around 2,500 private schools in England and Wales, and government figures show around half are registered as charities. Having charitable status means the schools cannot operate for profit and are eligible to claim some tax exemptions, including on donations and business rates. Since 2006, private schools have had to demonstrate they are creating public benefit in order to maintain their charitable status. Labour has said it would charge private schools 20% VAT and end business rates relief. It says this could raise an estimated £1.7 billion. A party spokesperson said the money would fund desperately needed teachers and mental health counselling in every secondary school. Last year, the Scottish Government scrapped business rate relief for private schools. The Conservatives have questioned whether tax changes would raise the £1.7 billion, as claimed by Labour. The problem of RAAC was highlighted again as parents with children at a secondary school in Durham, affected by the potentially unsafe concrete, staged a protest. Parents told Schools Minister Baroness Barron, who was visiting the school, that there had to be more support for the teachers and pupils and that the school must be rebuilt. The school is using a mix of face-to-face and online teaching after RAAC was found shortly before the return to school from the summer break. The Multi-Academy Trust in charge of the school has asked the DfE if it could use centre-assessed grades for GCSE and A-level pupils, similar to the way assessment was used during the pandemic. A DfE spokesman said it was working to bring back face-to-face teaching quickly and that the school would be rebuilt. Procurement, design and planning stages would be started before the end of the year. Schools Week reports on MPs' comments that government should create a school absence code specifically for mental health and review the adequacy of health services struggling with soaring waiting lists. The Parliamentary Education Committee has also urged the government to make its daily attendance data collection mandatory as soon as possible. The committee found growing demand for mental health services and special educational needs support, as well as the cost of living pressures and other issues, have compounded problems with attendance. However, Schools Minister Nick Gibbs said changes would add further complications for schools in coding absence, which could damage the accuracy of data. Full details of the committee's recommendations can be found in the article in Schools Week online. The Guardian covers news that in America, students at more than 50 high schools across the country are proposing a Green New Deal for schools. They are demanding that their districts teach climate justice, create pathways to green jobs, and plan for climate disasters. The campaign is seen as a reaction to right-wing efforts to ban or suppress climate education and activism at school. The national effort would see teach-ins, walkouts and petitions. The New Deal also calls for updated buildings and infrastructure to make schools more climate resilient. Further details can be found on the Guardian website. Finally, the Nuffield Trust has said that student loans in England should be written off for certain health staff once they have completed 10 years of NHS service. It says this is needed to stop a dropout crisis among nurses, midwives and other frontline staff. Ministers have rejected the idea, saying support is already in place and that the current student finance system strikes the right balance between the interests of students and taxpayers. as well as highlighting training grants, support for childcare and some expenses. Tuition fees are not charged in Scotland, and in Wales, tuition fees are covered if nurses and other frontline staff work for the NHS for 2 years. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Welcome back to the show. Just before the news, we were talking about what should be the first things that trainee teachers should be looking for when observing more experienced teachers. And Ben, you mentioned mainly focusing on those routines, because we're still quite early on in the year. Teachers will still be establishing those routines with their classes, what they expect students to be doing in the first few minutes of the lesson, how they introduce different tasks, what the end of the lesson looks like, and that there may be some school-wide routines, but the teachers will certainly have their own sort of own expectations of the class. And so for me as a trainee, when I'm looking at these routines and I'm thinking, yeah, I really like that one, but that's just not going to work with me because I don't have that same sort of personality as that teacher, and I'd like to do some things a little bit differently. How might I approach that when I start to take over, being able to sort of put my own stamp on it? Because you mentioned teacher autonomy, and I think that's an important thing about developing your own style. So I'm just wondering how best into our practice.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you, especially as a trainee, you do have a bit of autonomy and creativity, because whilst you are training and learning, you're also sort of like going through like a 12-week job interview in a way, not like The Apprentice, but on that sort of length of time of The Apprentice. But a school might be looking for a new science teacher or primary school teacher or geography teacher, and actually if you do a really good job, you're sort of not necessarily guaranteed a job, but you might be guaranteed an interview based on what you do. So it's really important to actually look at approach lessons in creative ways, and that doesn't mean that every lesson has to be like this absolutely amazing lesson where you recreate Narnia in your classroom. You want to have that element of creativity and fun, but it's also about making sure that high quality learning goes on in there. And actually, some of the best lessons are the ones that you keep incredibly simple, but they can also be the most fun lessons as well. And I think a lot of it can be things like when you're approaching a topic that you think is going to be particularly difficult, in terms of that it might be a concept that the children or students struggle to understand, or might be notoriously hard. It could be a topic that you think might be a little bit boring, but you're going to have to teach anyway. It might be a topic that you're not very knowledgeable on and that you have to educate yourself. Or equally, it could be something that you're really confident on and you've taught before and you've taught quite a lot of times. So I think the main thing is to decide, well, what area are you really strong at in terms of your delivery, and play to that strength, but also plan lessons and design activities and tasks that also allow you to stretch yourself and address the areas that you're not as confident in. So it might be that you're not as confident adapting your teaching for children who are more able and gifted and talented. So you design an activity, you reflect on that, and then you ask your mentor or whoever's in the room with you to keep an eye on that. But I think it's really important that you don't just pick up lessons that other people have planned. And yes, you will do that as a teacher. There'll be things that you pick up that others have planned and resourced, but you'll all deliver it in a slightly different way. So a lot of it comes down to the actual delivery and being yourself, your authentic self in the classroom as well, and showcasing that to not just your mentor who's in the room, but also the staff the children as well, and students.
Absolutely, all really good advice. And I think you sort of mentioned you don't need your classroom to become Narnia, and I think that raised the expectations far too much for anybody, for the children who you're teaching, but also yourself, because you're not going to be able to maintain that at all, are you? And I think, it's talking about the solid lessons, thinking about really good, solid pedagogy, and keep it simple, stupid, almost, isn't it? Sometimes, like, yes, you want things to be creative and fun, but also you do need it to be productive and And that's going to be really important in observing how we observe other teachers. What are they doing to keep a lesson engaging, particularly if it's a topic that's challenging or notoriously difficult? How are they communicating that to the children or the students, and how are the children responding to that and accommodating sort of different levels of learning? Something you mentioned also just before our break was you had a class that had something like 5 adults, I think you said, and so there's the teaching assistant, there's the trainee, there's also a supply teacher plus yourself, and that's obviously really unusual in a primary setting. But you also mentioned that the children responded quite differently to different adults in the room, and I think that's something I experienced this week, where I had this really tricky class on a Thursday afternoon. Now, I had observed them before. I knew that they were quite a chatty class. I knew that they were quite. There was certainly going to be some individuals that needed quite sort of careful managing. So I was ready for that. I was prepared for that. But of course, when I started teaching them, it wasn't a case of they were a little bit chatty. It was beyond that, and they certainly didn't have that sort of level of rapport or relationship or even respect for me that they had for their regular teacher. So I was sort of curious as to how you might go and establish that level of respect, because it's all very well observing another teacher who's already got that pre-established relationship, and you can take as many notes as you like and then think, I'm going to try doing that, and then it just doesn't work because you haven't got that same rapport with those students. So how would you approach that?
I think, and I've experienced that as well. Like I recently, in the last academic year, moved school mid-year, and I did a job. My role initially was as like an additional teacher across the school. So I used to teach in year 6 in the mornings, and then I did PPA cover in the afternoons. And then after SATs and after writing moderation, I went to being pretty much a supply teacher covering across the school. And it was really eye-opening how classes respond to you. So like the year 6's classes, whenever I used to cover them, they were absolutely fine. They knew who I was. They knew the expectations. And every time I then went and covered a class, I felt like, oh, I'm starting again, where I have to set those expectations again. And actually, I don't necessarily know what the teacher who usually has them, I don't know what they're like, what their teacher persona is like with that class. And it actually was a really good developmental tool, but in terms of behaviour management. And now this year, now that I'm a class teacher in the same school, it means I know a lot of the children. I've developed a slight relationship with a lot of the children, and they know who I am. And I think one thing you have to do is, first of all, before you do anything, before you've even started that lesson, is you need to set your expectations for the lesson. And actually, not just the expectations for that lesson, but every lesson that you do with children and with young adults. And even if that means that every lesson with a really difficult class, you have to go back to those expectations, that's what you do. And actually, one thing that I remember I used to do in my ECT year, and before I was before that I was an unqualified teacher, was in some cases if I had a really difficult lesson, I would just plough on rather than actually trying to address the behaviour. And I realised I was making it even harder for myself because I wasn't fulfilling those expectations. And in some cases, if you don't get the whole lesson done, it doesn't matter. You have to just go through and set those expectations following that behaviour policy. And I think in terms of trainee teachers and early career teachers, if you feel that, you know, a class's behaviour is getting worse or you're struggling, actually ask for that help, because it's better to do that than actually then come and have your observation and your feedback to be, oh, the behaviour was quite poor in that class, or like the behaviour wasn't managed very well. And I think it's one area you have to really hone in on really early on. So I remember back to my training journey, my first class, they were lovely. It was in a very deprived area, a very, very deprived area. And there was 2 very different classes in the year group I was in. The one was much quieter and calmer, and our one was a bit more louder and chattier, but they were lovely. And you just had to really set the expectations really high and be quite firm in some cases. And then my second placement, I had a class who had a job share, and the teachers were both brilliant teachers, but they both managed behaviour a little bit differently. And so it was interesting then to have another person, i.e. me, managing that behaviour as well. So I think it's really important to set those expectations, set that respect, and sort of look around, because it's really easy to say, oh, they're all doing it, they're all talking, they're all misbehaving. When actually, if you look at it and you analyse it and look back, it's actually only a couple of children or a couple of students. And I think sometimes the best thing to do, which is what I did, is I actually got our pastoral and behaviour lead when I was in my NQT year to come into my class, observe, but I said, I don't want you to observe me. I want you to observe the children and let me know who you notice. And in some cases, she picked out the children who I knew she was going to say, but there was other children who she said who weren't even on my radar, that they were getting really distracted. They were fidgeting. They weren't actually productive in the lesson. So I think sometimes it has to be an element of reflecting and ownership, but also really setting those high expectations as well.
Thank you. Yeah, there's so many points in there, and you sort of touched on the other things that I wanted to talk about on this show. Now, I had a teacher training placement this time last year, so I took a break from the course, and I've come back to it now. So I have done a term already. And something you said there is when you had the pastoral lead come in and observing other students, that was something that I did ask my mentor in my last school to do for me with one of my trickier classes. Was could you just look at the students, what's going on with the behaviour? How can I figure out the dynamics of this lesson? And she got the seating plan, and she marked on there, like, this student's doing that, this student's that, and with timestamps as well. So where in the lesson were things starting to go wrong, or where was it unravelling? And that was really useful feedback. So I would encourage other trainees to do that. Actually just ask their mentors or whoever happens to be observing them, this lesson perhaps focus more on the students, because that is actually going to be a reflection on my practice as well. Because sometimes it's going to be, maybe it was my pacing that was really off, and therefore concentration was starting to wander, and that's when I started to lose the class or something like that. So they're still observing me, just sort of indirectly, and I think that's a really good tip.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that can go for anything in terms of behaviour, and not just behaviour, as in any element of your practice. Like, if you can really own what you're struggling with or you're finding particularly difficult, then it shows that you're being really proactive, and it's not as much of a shock that, if you get that in an observation feedback, and it then gives you a target that you can work towards. I think it's just a really useful thing to do. I also did it for when it wasn't a behaviour thing, but I'd said, and it was in the same school, it was in my NQT ECT year, that I found maths much more of a struggle to teach than English, and I found that my class were weaker in maths than they were in English. I myself preferred English to maths. I preferred teaching it, preferred planning it. And our deputy head at the time was the maths lead, a very experienced maths lead. And I said, what I actually asked her for was, I said, could you come and model a lesson for me, a maths lesson? And she said, well, why don't I observe you teaching a maths lesson so I can see what are your strengths, because she actually said, you're beating yourself up and you're being really hard on yourself at the moment about your maths teaching, because she said, looking in your books, I think the children are really strong where they are. And obviously, for context, this was just around the time, this was during COVID and just after COVID. So obviously there was loads of gaps that children had. And she said, well, you teach a lesson, I'll observe it, I'll look at what your strengths are and what your areas for development are. And then what I'll do is I will plan a maths lesson and teach it in your class. You will observe me and I will address your areas of development in that lesson. So, for example, one of the things she said was actually all the activities were fine. She said the activities were fine. She said where I was a little bit weaker was in some cases in some elements of my modelling. So she said my modelling on the whole was really good. I did an I do, we do, you do approach. But actually I modelled 3 very different concepts. Like, it was the same area of maths, but the way I modelled it and the representations I used were 3 different representations, which got a little bit confusing for the children. And then she said, and during the assessment, when the children were on their independent task, I was sort of panicking a little bit because I could see certain children hadn't understood it. And I was basically trying to firefight. And she then modelled in the lesson the way to model a maths concept, and then also she modelled assessment for learning. And what she did was, in the lesson, is she narrated it for me. So she'd set the children off on a task, and then she'd say, right, Ben, what I'm doing now is I'm lapping the room. I'm going to lap for about 3 minutes. I'm letting the children, I'm not going to interject with any children unless they ask me a question. And this is where I can see, well, do I need to regroup anyone? And it was really useful. And then I did the same, even though I didn't find it as much of a struggle, but because it was so useful. In the same school at the time, our assistant head teacher who was leading English, I said, could you do the same but for an English lesson? And we did the exact same thing, and it worked really, really well. And I did it again for a 3rd time with science, with our head teacher who taught a science lesson. So it's not just good for behaviour, it's good for lots of areas as well. I realise that was a really long answer to a question, sorry.
No, that's great. And that detail is really useful, because there was so much in that answer. And I think that is the power of being able to observe other teachers, isn't it? And have other teachers observe you, because it is a learning opportunity, and particularly in primary, where, you said that maths was not, you weren't as comfortable with maths as you were with English. And so that modelling aspect for you, being able to sort of better learn how to model, how to roam the room, that assessment for learning as well, that was a useful skill for you to develop. And I think that's going to be the case even in secondary, where yes, you may be a sort of greater subject expert, but there will be areas in it that you're not as comfortable with, and you can still develop the modelling. I know that's something that I need to work on as well, is how I model things, because I can sometimes just, oh, here it is, off you go, and you think the kids don't have a clue what's going on. So that is something I'm working on myself. And I wanted to also touch back to something you said earlier about not being worried about timings, because this is something I am absolutely paranoid about at the moment, because I know it is one of my greatest weaknesses as a teacher, is the pacing aspect of my lessons. It is ensuring that I get through the material that I have planned. And sometimes the best laid lesson plans just go out the window when something happens, and it's just hard to follow, or I go off on a tangent because it's something that's interested me. But what you said earlier was really useful, because actually, when you've set in those expectations, actually sometimes, yes, it may take you a bit longer. No, you may not get through all that planned material. But if I'm standing there waiting for quiet, and I'm sort of thinking I need to move on, and I can feel the seconds and the minutes ticking by, and I'm not going to get through my material, but actually it's like that short-term pain, isn't it, for long-term gain in that respect. Thinking about, I'm going to get this class really under control, and that is going to make my lesson pacing much better going forward. So no, it's lots of really good stuff that you said there. And I did ask some of the other trainees that I know if they had any questions for you, and I did get some really interesting ones, both from primary and secondary trainees. And one of them asked, should trainees sort of function as teaching assistants when they're observing, perhaps helping out? Should they, if a student has the hand up, can the trainee maybe sort of help out too? And that, I feel like this is going to vary a lot between different teachers and what they like. But what's your view on that? Should trainees sort of try and be invisible or present?
I definitely think that trainees shouldn't be invisible, because I think sometimes you might be observing the teacher who's your mentor, who's in the classroom with you all the time, and you might be a bit more comfortable with them, so you might feel a bit more confident to go and interject. In some cases, you might be sent to go and observe another teacher who you don't really know very well. But I think what often happens is, the majority of time, say I've been observed as a teacher, I've not had an additional adult in the room. So when I had like my observations, like my NQT year and thereafter, I only recall one in like my first 2 years of teaching where I got observed, and there was another adult in the room as like a teaching assistant plus the observer. All the other times just me and the observer. And actually, I've been I've always had observers who've then helped out in lessons or sat with certain children. And I think sometimes when you go to observe a lesson, and especially if it's a teacher that you don't usually work with, ask, where do you want me to sit? Do you want me to sit with any particular children? Do you want me to sit by a certain desk? It might be that they've got a really chatty group at the back, and could you sit with them and just help in between the observations, just keep or notes you're making, could you just keep them, refocus them, kind of thing. Or there might be a group of children who are not chatty at all, or a group of students who argue during discussions or group work, and I think it's definitely something you shouldn't be invisible. And I've always, when I've gone in as now that I've now been like a middle leader in a school, or when I've mentored a student, I've always made sure that I help as a teaching assistant. So even if it's not my class, I would go and sit and with a group of children, or rotate around groups of children. So definitely don't remain invisible. Definitely get involved.
Yeah, really good. And I think, almost being, it does change the dynamic in the room, doesn't it? If there's another adult in the room, irrespective of who they are, even if they're trying to remain invisible, the students still know that you're there. So there is going to be a dynamic change, isn't there? And there's no point in trying to pretend there isn't. So, but some trainees I know have been asked to do things like photocopying or picking up some printing and that sort of thing. Is that something that is expected of a trainee? Should they be expected to actually do those sorts of tasks? Or should they be speaking up about that?
I think it's definitely something that people should be doing. I think it's one of those things where, everyone should be contributing slightly. And I think one of the things as trainees, you often, I was encouraged to do when I was training, is when you go into a school is, and once you've done all your jobs, offer to help out, or when you first arrive at a school and you're not actually teaching, anything I can do to help you. And if that is just, trimming something or photocopying something, then go and do it. If you're constantly being used more of like an admin assistant than a trainee teacher, then that's a bit different then. Like if you feel that you're doing it overly, and often what you will find is, as you pick up more teaching and your mentor is therefore not teaching, they will then return the favour, if you like. I know it's something that happened to me and something that I would do for a trainee I had. So it's about having that balance, but it's not something that is beneath you as a trainee, but also it's not something you should be doing all of the time.
Yeah, a balance, isn't it? And that's a good answer. And I think, teachers are busy, and sometimes I know sometimes there are days where you just think, oh my goodness, I've forgotten to do this photocopying, and I've got this lesson in 5 minutes. And I have had people who've offered, oh no, I've got a PPA period now, I'll bring it over to you. And you think, oh, that's really helpful, and that's just really saved me a bit of panic there. And so I think, we do need to help each other out, don't we? But it's as you say, if it's becoming a routine thing where you're becoming just the guy who or the girl who photocopies or whatever, then maybe that's less acceptable. You need to sort of just say something there. But so it's one of the other things I wanted to ask, and this doesn't come from me, but comes from somebody else who wanted me to ask this on the show, is when they've been asked as somebody who's observing an experienced teacher, did they have any feedback for that teacher? And they found that, in one respect, they found that really good, because that teacher was open to feedback from a trainee, and that was nice to see. But also they felt quite uncomfortable in that they didn't really know what to say, because they didn't want to criticize another teacher's practice, or think that if they just laid on the praise that this was the best lesson ever, that it'd be quite disingenuous. So how would you approach, if you're in the trainee's shoes, actually having that communication with a more experienced teacher?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it's really refreshing that people do ask for feedback, and it's obviously something that's really good that people do. I think one thing is, in terms of whenever doing an observation, and I know it's really easy as a trainee teacher to, especially when you see a really, really good teacher teaching, that you sit there with your notebook and you write everything they do down, and you're like, I'm going to implement everything they do in my next lesson, and that kind of thing. And you see like these children, particularly when you're working in a primary school with particularly younger children, and you see them like in awe of their teacher. I think what you should be doing is when you go into an observation is looking at one area, one particular thing. I know it's a bit different when you get observed, that you get observed on everything. But when you're, say, being more informally observed, if you like, aka when you're teaching and your mentor is in the room, is ask them, like, in this lesson, could you really watch how I assess the children or question the children, and then give me some feedback? So I think when you go in and watch a teacher, you should have something in mind that you want to go and observe and get out of that lesson. So if it's, for example, I'm thinking of a primary school here, I'm going to go, I don't know anything about phonics and teaching children how to read, so I'm going to go and watch the phonics leader and see what he or she does. And what you can then do is then say, when you're asked, if you're asked that question, oh, what did you think of my lesson? You can comment specifically on that, and also not just narrate the positives, and also something you think, oh, I might have done that a little bit differently. And it doesn't mean that you're saying to that teacher, oh, you've done that wrong, because actually you're more inexperienced than them anyway. You're actually saying, oh, that's something I would naturally do more differently. So it's really nice that you've been asked, and obviously make sure that you always say thank you for letting them observe you, whether that be verbally or following up with an email. It's always really important that you thank them for their time. But definitely, it's great that they've asked you for that feedback. But if you're really honing in on that observation and just going to observe one thing, that should hopefully make it a lot easier.
No, really good advice. And I think, thinking about actually just focusing on one thing, because I know when you first start out, that, like you said, the temptation is to write absolutely everything down, and you end up with this absolute wall of notes that's not really very useful in terms of when you come back to look at it, because it's just disjointed. Trying to focus on that one thing. Would you tell the teacher in advance that is the thing that you're going to specifically look out for in that lesson?
Yeah, I think there's one thing that I did when I had my student last year, is when she first started, I said, what do you want to get out of this placement? What do you really want to see? What do you want me to look out for? And so that I can plan things like observations for you. So, and just like when I joined my new school and I was at the end of my second ECT year, my mentor there would say, well, what do you want to see? And then I will pick out who I know is the best or most confident in those areas. So, for example, for me, it was adaptive teaching. So I said, how do you inclusion, adaptive teaching? Who would you go and recommend and observe? Someone else joined at the same time who was an ECT, and hers was behaviour. She wanted to see behaviour. And they recommended to her two of my Year 6 colleagues who I could vouch for that they were brilliant at managing behaviour. So it's probably best if you said to your mentor, right, I want to see this. Who would you suggest going to see? They suggest someone, and then you can say to that person, oh, yeah, I'm really looking for this in that lesson. And actually then you'll probably find that the teacher will specifically overemphasize and model those areas, or will have that discussion with you in the lesson. Some of the best people, when they are being observed, will interact with that observer and say, this is what I'm doing. Whether that be an observation for your development, whether that be an observation for a performance management. So if I think to my current school, I went to observe the phonics leader teaching, and it wasn't that I needed it really, it was just that I hadn't really taught phonics. Well, I haven't taught phonics ever since I've been a qualified teacher. I've taught it as a trainee teacher, not as a qualified teacher. And I observed the phonics leader, who was absolutely amazing. He's absolutely amazing teacher. But she would then, when the children were on task, or even like in her input as she was giving them an activity, she would talk to me and say, right, this is what I'm doing now. And she would narrate that thing that I was looking at for me, which was really, really useful. So yeah, definitely tell the person observing what you're looking for, and sort of and why you're looking for it as well. Like, why do you want it? It might be that it's an area you're struggling with. It might be like me in that scenario. It's something I just didn't know much about, so I wanted to just improve my knowledge. But yeah, definitely share that with whoever's observing, you're observing.
Yeah, and I really like the way you mentioned that actually sometimes that teacher will narrate what they're doing as part of the lesson. You mentioned it earlier as well when you had somebody doing the maths lesson that you wanted to see how they were modelling and doing the AFL and that sort of thing. And I think, that's a really good point, because quite a lot of what happens in the classroom is kind of invisible. It's those little micro gestures or movements, or the teachers just they're glancing at a student who may just be losing their focus, and that's not necessarily going to be obvious to you as a trainee when you're new to it. And so actually having that chance to follow up with the teacher, and maybe they can fill in some of the blanks that you didn't notice during your observation, is going to be really powerful.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're going to take just a quick break here while we hear from our sponsors.
Teaching is a rewarding profession, but it comes with its fair share of challenges. That's where ADAPT come in. We're not your typical trade union, but instead a modern, apolitical alternative, offering expert legal, employment and mental health support. Protection without the politics. So what makes ADAPT different? We're always apolitical and independent, specialised solely in supporting individual teachers. Our caseworkers are professionally qualified, ensuring you always get the best advice. Plus, there's 24/7 mental health support. Whether it's a simple contract check or handling serious allegations, ADAPT are here for you. Join the thousands of educators who've chosen ADAPT to protect their careers. Subscribe at adapt.org.uk today. ADAPT. Supporting school staff. Protecting careers.
Welcome back to the show. We've been talking today about classroom observations, particularly for trainee teachers, and how they can get the most out of observing other teachers, but also being observed by more experienced teachers. We've been looking at establishing those routines and expectations with new classes, how we can start to incorporate more creativity and a bit of autonomy as well as we start to take over lessons. We've been thinking about modelling and how we can sort of trying to focus in on specific aspects of classroom practice with more experienced teachers. Now, I've got a question for Ben that is perhaps going to be quite a controversial one. And this question comes from a science trainee. And he said to me that he's sometimes spotted in some classes, the teacher he's been observing has said something wrong. So something wrong with the science. And for him as a physics specialist, perhaps that other teacher was a biology specialist or something. That's going to be a really tricky thing to navigate. So I was just interested to see how you would navigate that if you as a trainee have actually seen a teacher teach something wrong.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting one, and hopefully is something that's very uncommon. I think it's quite hard as a trainee that, and in some cases when you are a trainee, there will be some things that you see. I'm not just talking about, say, this. There might be some elements of practice that you don't agree with. It might be that you end up actually training in a school that isn't the right school for you and isn't the right fit, and you might not like it there, and that's very difficult. What you have to remember is when you become a qualified teacher is you get to, apply to where you want to and sort of choose where to work in a way. I think it's something that should be addressed like privately. So maybe you might want to address it with that teacher. You might want to address it with your mentor, but not in a way where that other person's going to get into trouble. Like you said, it could be that, say, in fact, for a science, if they're a biology specialist and they're teaching physics, it's just like, my background and specialism, if you like, is humanities. So, I know that I'm very good at geography, for example, at a primary level, not at a secondary level or like A level. But that if I was to observe another teacher teaching, I wouldn't necessarily, and as now a qualified teacher, even now I probably wouldn't address it in front of a whole class, unless it's something I think that would be very detrimental to those children. I would probably take the teacher to one side as the children are starting to be like, oh, let me tell you about this kind of thing. But it's definitely something that is worth raising, because it could be a really integral part of learning for those children as well.
Yeah, I mean, doing it privately where possible, and actually just being sensitive about it. And I think, you mentioned humanities. I mean, I'm doing geography, but I do know I've got a science background. My degree is in geology and marine biology. So there are some aspects of geography that I haven't really studied since I was 16. And I do appreciate there are some gaps in my knowledge that I am less comfortable with. And I personally would want somebody to tell me if I'm doing something wrong, although I hope I wouldn't, because I'd have prepared and studied the material if there's anything I was a little bit uncomfortable with. before. But also equally, I'm thinking, actually, there are some cases where I might choose to simplify or not dumb down, but simplify a concept just to make it more accessible to a class, rather than maybe give them all the details. Because I know there are some areas of geography that I'm really comfortable with and I know a lot about, and the temptation is to overfill the lesson with tons of detail and all the complexities that comes with, which there are a lot of in geography, and perhaps overwhelm them. So sometimes I wonder if actually more experienced teachers do choose just to be, just to give them sort of the basics, even if it's not necessarily strictly accurate, because maybe they'll take A level in the future, and then they'll get the bigger picture then. Maybe.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, it might come down to individual teachers' own strengths and subject knowledge. And I think one of the things to do, whether you're a trainee or whether you're when you go for your first teaching job or even thereafter, is try and find a school or a department or find out when you're within there about different people's strengths and areas for development in terms of even within your department and within your subject knowledge, there'll be people that know about certain areas of geography. For example, let's use the example of geography in your department that you're currently training in. There might be some people who are really interested in the human aspects of geography and more about tourism and things like that. There might be people who are more interested in more physical elements of geography or field work. And actually, it's about ascertaining who's the best person to go and talk to, really. So you might find that you're teaching a lesson that you don't know much about. You might do a bit of Googling or whatever, or do some reading. But actually going to have those conversations. And I think one thing I have to say was a real strength of my last school, and not saying it isn't a strength of my current school, but in my last school, which was a very small teaching team, as there was only one class per year group, compared to now I'm in a school where there's 3 classes per year group. The head teacher, you could tell, had recruited really well in terms of complementary areas of strength and development in terms of subject knowledge. So you've got myself, who was more of a humanities person. We'd got someone who'd got a languages degree and was fluent in French and Spanish, and she was our French lead. We've got someone who got a drama degree, so she was more like performing arts. We'd got someone else who was more sciencey and more of an engineering background, someone more maths, someone who was just really creative and really liked things like DT and art. So if you can find that, which hopefully most head teachers will do, then that would be really beneficial for not just trainees, but everyone in the school, even those teachers who've got 20 plus years experience.
No, all really good. And I think something you mentioned is actually eventually trainees will be looking for jobs. They will be, some may be looking for jobs now and keeping an eye out, even though it's still really early on in the year. But I do know last year when I was training, some of the people in my cohort had jobs lined up by November. So really early on that these were starting to be advertised. I think it's really interesting to think actually going into other schools and observing how things are done in other schools, not necessarily even with a job interview, or sort of looking to get a job interview in the future, but just as part of your general CPD is actually going to be really interesting to think about that. And that does sort of lead me on to a question. Secondary trainees need to do some time in a primary school. And I can imagine a lot of secondary trainees don't want to do that because they've chosen secondary for a reason. They don't want to work with the little kids. How would you, what advice would you give to secondary trainees coming in to working for a day or a week or however long it is on their programme with a year 6 class or any other classes within the primary school?
I think it's just about, I think it's a really useful thing. I never had that experience of going, say, to a secondary school or working in early years or anything as part of my training. So I think the fact that people have that is actually a real benefit, because particularly if you do get the chance to work with, say, children in upper key stage 2 who will soon be a feeder secondary school, it's really good to be able to have that time to see, well, what do the teachers do with them? What elements of the curriculum? And often I think people are quite impressed with, the level that we cover things in primary and what we cover in primary compared to, years ago when it wasn't as probably ambitious in the old national curriculum. Of course, there's always going to be that argument there about things that are on the curriculum and should they be on there and so on. But I think one thing is just remembering that the children that you currently teach as a secondary trainee teacher were the people you're now currently around in that primary setting a couple of years ago. So they've all come from the same place. That just use that opportunity to learn, and just remember that actually the teachers will think they'll be using modelling techniques that probably are using in secondary school. I think one thing that is a real eye-opener, particularly in my last school, was some of the things that we were doing. So one of the areas I led on in my previous school was looking at how we improved the use of things like retrieval practice and low stakes quizzing across the foundation subjects and within science. And some of the things that our teachers were using were actually techniques and activities and strategies that were also used in the secondary phase. So actually there might be some things that you can pick up there as well and see what they're doing, and then take it back to where you currently are training as well.
No, it's really good, because I before I started my teacher training, I worked as a teaching assistant in a primary school, and I absolutely loved it. And I was mostly working with a year 6 class. But there were times when the school asked me, "Oh, could you go and work in early years?" And I'm thinking, "Oh God, I can't stand the idea of working with 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds." But actually, I found that was some of the most rewarding. That was some of the most rewarding experience I've ever had, was working in an early years setting, seeing how these teachers actually taught the fundamentals of speech and language and writing. I'm thinking, actually, there's an awful lot there that I can now take into secondary when I'm introducing complex concepts that students need to learn. And actually, it's a really big step up for them. I'm thinking, well, actually, these students had to learn to write. And you mentioned phonics as well. Seeing how phonics practice worked, this is a revelation for me. And I've got a huge level of respect for the teachers who introduced these things. And absolutely, with the modelling, I feel that there's a lot that I've taken out of having worked as a teaching assistant in primary that I'm now bringing into my secondary practice.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think that's why, like I said last year when I was doing the cover role across the school, like, it does really open your eyes when you go and see other, year groups and teachers, and it really challenges you, but you'll often find that you do your best learning. But yeah, if you go that for even further down the school and you see that fundamentals of, just how the teachers in reception teach children the routines, like walking to assembly, walking, all that developing of independence, it's really like inspiring in a way, and I think people who haven't done like early years or year 1, for example, that you sort of have a newfound respect for those people when you do it. Just like I think that actually primary have a profound respect for secondary, and secondary probably have a profound respect for primary as well.
Yeah, and that something you mentioned there is actually things like routines of walking to assembly. And I think in observations, we're not just observing a classroom, but we're observing the school as a whole. And actually, that's going to be another thing to think about. Observing teachers when they're on duty in the playground, or, as you say, walking to assembly, or doing other things outside of the classroom. And that's something else that that we do need to sort of be thinking about. Actually, those routines. And I know in secondary, some of these times, I think, you think, oh, they've got these children and they don't know these routines. They don't have this independence. But they did in primary school, because they've been taught it, and you think, why have they lost some of that resilience or independence moving up into secondary? And perhaps actually we need to maybe have a little bit more cross pollination between these phases, so we can actually just transition students better. And I know the transitions are becoming, there's more sort of transition days and that sort of thing now, which is really good to see. But yeah, there's a lot of food for thought there, I think. I'm sort of thinking out loud now. But no, absolutely. I think more sort of cross-pollination we can have, the better.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, like you said, it's really interesting that when you're going in to observe a lesson, you're actually observing, like how a school functions. And I think one thing you have to remember is when, senior leaders or middle leaders even are going in to observe, actually, they're not often like really honing in on a teacher. Obviously, yes, there is an element of that for teacher development and performance management, but often it's for monitoring of, well, have we implemented this initiative well enough? So the one for me was, like I said, one of the areas I led in my previous school was retrieval practice and low stakes quizzing. And I'd done some CPD on it at the beginning of September and and it was actually something I trialled in my class that the head teacher had noticed and thought, oh, that's worked really well, but that's not happening in the other year groups. Let's sort of implement it. And it worked really well. And the teachers found that actually what they said was, because it was something that a teacher had trialled in their own classroom that worked, they were really confident in implementing it in their classroom. And then my role as an observer then was actually, it was more so on me. Was my training effective? Was the support I've given staff effective, rather than actually saying to the staff, you did a bit of a rubbish job there. Not that I would say that to anyone anyway. You did a rubbish job there of implementing that. And I think that's I think the same. I was a humanities lead in a primary school. I was looking at history teaching. I was more so looking at, well, is the history curriculum that I hadn't written it, but that the head teacher had written, has that been implemented effectively, and what was I going to do? So I know it doesn't help that I know it does put sometimes stress and strain on teachers, but actually observations, and hopefully the people listening to this or who listen back to this will see that observations are one of the or learning walks or drop-ins. I think drop-ins are probably a bit more effective than observations, but they're one of the most helpful developmental processes for yourself, and often for a school as well. It is quite hard, and I know there's a lot of talk about, are they effective or not, and which forms of monitoring are best. And actually, yes, it does put stress on people, but actually they're very beneficial as well for you. And I think that's one thing as a trainee teacher that people should really make the most of, is that other person in the room, that teacher in the room. It is your opportunity to take risks, and they might not work, but it's okay. Whereas it's a bit harder when you're the only person in the room, when you're a qualified teacher and you don't have that person you can ask for their thoughts or bounce off as well.
How do you manage that stress when you have a learning walk or something like that, or somebody's just dropped in unexpectedly to your lesson?
I think it's about I think it's a bit different. If you know it's going to happen, the stress might build up. Sometimes if it just happens that they drop it, if people drop in, then it just all of a sudden might come on. I think the one thing is to remember, actually, the best thing to do is, after you've had that observation, is to go and own your feedback. So go and ask, because some people don't go and ask. If you're having a formal observation, say if it's part of your trainee teach program or your ECT years, you're going to expect that feedback to be written, but also to be fed back to you. Whereas if it's just more informal, people might. So, for example, like in my new school, one thing that the SLT do every September is they do a really informal learning walk across the school, sort of at the end of September, where they'll look at the learning environments, they'll look at the transition of children, they'll look at routines, and they'll look at how well the children have settled in. And they used to do that in my previous school as well, except it was a little bit earlier. It was sort of the end of the second week in September. And I went to go and ask for feedback, and as I was actually going to ask for feedback, the member of SLT that came into my room was actually coming to me to feedback. But I was showing them that I was taking ownership there. And I think some cases, if you can reflect on that lesson and think, well, what went well, what didn't go well, you can actually then start the conversation. Sometimes the best observers will say first, how did you feel it went? What are you thinking? And that's usually when trainees are really hard on themselves and say, it went absolutely awful, it's rubbish, I'm a rubbish teacher, blah, blah, blah. Whereas I think that's more effective. Whereas if sometimes a leader or an observer can go in and just start listing bullet points to you, is then but it's not as helpful. But you've also got to remember, even when you're a qualified teacher, you're never going to be the finished article, and actually every little bit of feedback is a little bit of something that's going to help make you an even better teacher than you were yesterday. So I think that's a way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I think you said own your feedback, and I think sometimes there's a tendency to become a bit defensive, isn't there? I mean, teaching is one of those jobs where you put a lot of yourself into it. You've done a lot of planning. You're up there. You're quite vulnerable in many respects, being in front of a class, and then for somebody to come in and they're going to criticize your classroom practice, but actually we need to be open to that feedback, because as you say, none of us are the finished article. Whether we're trainees or whether we're 30 years into the job, there's always going to be something to learn and to develop from, and actually that's going to be really important, not to be defensive and actually to be open to that feedback.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also it's about that when you do have some really, really good feedback, is celebrate it. Like, I don't know what you're going to do, but that night, go and get yourself a takeaway, or go to the pub, or, go to the cinema or whatever. But equally, if it isn't the best feedback that you got, don't sit at home and, dwell on it too much. Like, just think that tomorrow's a new day and you're going to do something, you might do something a little bit different. And I think that's really important, that it's really easy to dwell, to go and sit in your classroom, maybe have a cry, maybe whatever you do. And in some cases, you do need to talk about it. You might have had a really rubbish lesson that you feel, even if it wasn't one that was observed, just one that you felt that didn't go very well, but actually finding someone to talk it through, whether that be your mentor, whether it just be the person in the school or the department that you get on the best with, whether it be a family or friend or a partner at home, like, find someone to talk it through. I think it's really important to do that.
I mean, you said earlier, like, when a teacher says, "How do you think that went?" For me as a trainee, my brain just goes, "Oh gosh, what's the right answer to this?" Because I'll try to anticipate what they're going to say, and I think, well, if I think it went really well, and then they say, "Oh well, it wasn't actually; it was X, Y, Z. That was all rubbish," and anything, I'd say, "Oh no, I don't want to say that." But if I thought it was, if I thought it was terrible, then it's going to make me sound like an absolute misery guts. And yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? It's I do find that a really difficult question to answer. But equally, I think, I've mentioned it a couple of times on the show today. I had this lesson in period 6 last week, and it just didn't go very well. And I'm sort of conscious that that's almost coming to define my entire week, was this one 55-minute lesson that was not the best. And I'm thinking, actually, I'm going to look at my exercise book that I've got that teachers have been observing, just writing informal notes in. And actually, there's a lot of positive stuff in there. And I can see that I'm making progress. I can see that teachers are saying, that lesson was so much snappier than the one you did the week before. You're getting really, building up that pace, and the students are really starting to sort of like you and develop that relationship, and they're responding, and you've got good subject knowledge. And think, actually, there was a lot of positive things there, and I need to not remember to dwell upon that negative. But equally, I obviously need to think about it, reflect upon it, and what am I going to do better? But just try and celebrate the wins and reflect upon the things that need to be worked on.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. And it's really good that you've done that, because I think it is, like you said, it's really easy to dwell. And I think just like, it's really, you'll find a way of like reflecting and that your own way. So your way then was looking in that exercise book where people put the informal notes. Some people prefer to, like, journal or to write a blog or whatever, or to talk. And I think whatever you find your outlet as your way of reflection, but also of offloading as well, is really important. And to just basically not dwell on it. And I know it's really hard, because you want the best for the children, you want the best for the teacher, you want to do the best. Like, I remember my third and final training placement I did, and it was around the time of COVID, so we're in our COVID bubbles. I was in the same school for my second and third placement. I did a 3-year degree. My second placement had got cut short because of COVID, and I was invited to go back to this school, which initially, when I started my teacher training, I said I was only going to go, I wanted 3 different schools to go to. But I felt like my work was sort of not finished, so I went back there. And I remember teaching this lesson to this absolutely lovely Year 5 class. And it didn't go very well. It was a writing lesson, and I could tell the teacher was a little bit disappointed, and I felt like I'd let her down, and I felt really bad. And like it wasn't, I don't think I'm not sure if it was one of my formal lesson observations or not, but I can't remember. But I remember then that afternoon I taught a really good science lesson, and then the next week I then taught another really good science lesson. That was my observed lesson. But I equally then the next day taught a really good English lesson. And she was really good at praising me, saying, well, look at that English lesson compared to yesterday. You've started to act on the feedback, which is brilliant. And I think if you've got that mentor as well that is really encouraging of you, or that senior mentor or induction tutor or whoever, whichever members of staff are around you supporting you, maybe your head of department, like as long as you've got that as well, hopefully they will be the people to boost you up as well as boosting yourself and actually saying, do you know what, I did a really good job at that and I'm going to go and celebrate this weekend by doing this, for example.
Yeah, really good. And I think, we do have to act upon that feedback. And I think one of the things I want to ask you about, we've only got a few minutes left of the show, but when teachers are just starting out teaching, there is, of course, going to be an awful lot of things that need to be worked on. But there'll still be positives too, but there's going to be a lot that needs to be worked on. So for you as a mentor who's observing trainees, how do you prioritise what is the most important thing for a trainee to be working on within their first few weeks, and then perhaps after half term, how are we going to sort of dig a bit deeper into their development?
I think it's really important to as a mentor, you've hopefully been appointed by the senior leadership team to have a student because you're very good at, giving feedback and developing others and coaching in some cases, not just mentoring, rather than that you've just been given a student because we need someone to have that student kind of thing. So hopefully, like you're someone who can is as a mentor that can do that. And I think what it is, in terms of when you have your very first observation, I think that is a real eye-opener for the mentor, because actually it's the first time they've seen you properly teach a full lesson, and they can really ascertain, well, what are your strengths and what are your areas for development, and what is going to be the next lever that will make the biggest impact. Because there might be, if you're on your very first training placement, your very, very first observation, there's going to be a whole list of things you could improve on, but the best mentors will pick one thing, the one thing that is going to make the impact. Often it probably will be related to behaviour. So, for example, like when I was in my first training placement, I got observed, I was always told that behaviour management was a real strength of mine whilst I was training. But one thing I wasn't as good at in terms of behaviour was actually praising children. I was very good at actually managing negative behaviour, low-level disruption, but I wasn't as strong at rewarding children. And that was something that I had to then really make sure I included within my practice. So I think it's really important that mentors are aware of that. And if you think in terms of like the ECF and the ITT framework, behaviour is one. In terms of the ECF, behaviour and most of the providers is the first area you will cover in both year 1 and year 2. So often it probably will be something relating to behaviour, and it is really important that you do get that area right to then be really successful in the rest of your areas. But also it's then putting the ownership as you become more experienced as a trainee and then as a teacher, saying, well, what do you want to work on? What do you think you need to work on? What do you really want to achieve? It might be that you're really struggling with your behaviour management, and that's okay to admit. Actually, I really struggled with behaviour management when I first started as a qualified teacher, after having 3 placements when my behaviour management was always graded really highly. So, and that was a really hard thing for me to admit. But then also there was other areas that I was probably weaker on in my teacher training that I then became really strong at. So it's going to be this constant learning curve, but it's ultimately that a mentor can identify what is going to make the most impact on that teacher to then have the most impact on the students that they're teaching.
No, really good answer. And I think that ties in really nicely with what you were saying right at the beginning of this show, because what's the priority for us as trainees when we're observing other teachers at this time of year? It's establishing those routines, those expectations, and that's going to feed into the behaviour. That's probably the thing that most trainees are going to be most nervous about, and the thing that is probably arguably one of the hardest things to develop, because it is such a dynamic practice that you constantly have to be having to think on your feet and adapt to changing situations. We're just going to take a quick break now while we hear from our sponsors.
Teaching is a rewarding profession, but it comes with its fair share of challenges. That's where ADAPT come in. We're not your typical trade union, but instead a modern, apolitical alternative, offering expert legal, employment and mental health support. Protection without the politics. So what makes ADAPT different? We're always apolitical and independent, specialised solely in supporting individual teachers. Our caseworkers are professionally qualified, ensuring you always get the best advice. Plus, there's 24/7 mental health support. Whether it's a simple contract check or handling serious allegations, EDAPT are here for you. Join the thousands of educators who've chosen EDAPT to protect their careers. Subscribe at edapt.org.uk today. EDAPT. Supporting school staff. Protecting careers.
Okay, just as we come into the last few minutes of the show, we've been talking about how what mentors are looking from trainees within the first few weeks, and how trainees can sort of prioritize different aspects of their development. And I think one of the things that I remember when I was in school, and you get a piece of marking back from a teacher and you look at your work and it is just covered in red pen, and you think, where on earth am I supposed to start in digesting this? And you think, there's just too much here. I don't care, because it's clearly a rubbish piece of work that there's no point. There's nowhere for me to develop because I'm rubbish at this subject. And I have to admit, I've had lessons like that where I've had a teacher observe me, and I've had some written notes, I've had some verbal feedback, and there's just been so much in it, and I can't easily digest all of this information. I'm thinking, I'm just trying to think, what is the main common thread in this? That's the thing I need to work on. So, Ben, I was just wondering, how would you try and pick out, if this is the case, perhaps it's not somebody who is a mentor, it's somebody else who perhaps doesn't have as much experience working with trainees, and perhaps a little bit overwhelming with the feedback, particularly early on in the course. How would you pick out the most important things to focus on?
I think that's a really good question. I think what you should do is, maybe if you see that there's a certain thing that keeps being mentioned in that feedback, then maybe that's the area. It might be that you go and actually say to that person who's observed you, if it is your mentor that actually isn't as experienced, or they've given you all of these things to do, you then go and say to them, could you help me decide what my next step is? Hopefully all observations for trainees come with next steps in terms of what they should address. And then if you still feel like you don't know, is actually you should have a senior member of staff who oversees all aspects of early career, whether that be, they might not oversee everything, but you should have a senior leader who oversees, initial teacher training and ITE students, and speak to them, or speak to your tutor, your link tutor, or your lecturer, your provider, because ultimately, if you don't know where to go, then you're not going to go anywhere ultimately. So you need that really explicitly clear to you, so you know what to work on. So yeah, just ask, and keep asking. Like I said, keep asking up if you're not sure.
No, yeah, communication. I think sometimes just speaking to my mentor has been really helpful for that, and thinking about, actually, I just need to, and I think on one occasion, actually, my mentor said, don't worry about it, because don't worry about it, just focus on the thing that, as you say, has been repeated, and in my case, that's quite often, it's been the pacing aspect of my lessons, and trying to focus on that, because actually, if you can focus on that main thing that's been the main common thread, actually, that's probably going to improve other aspects of the lesson, whether it's behaviour, whether it's adaptive teaching and inclusion. Just if I can improve that main thing, that is probably the biggest weakness. So one of the things I've been encouraged to do on my PGCE course is to reflect upon each lesson that I teach. And so what I've been doing, and in my case, I've got an exercise book that's just got informal observations in, and this isn't going to be shared with anyone, this is just for me. I've just been writing a few sentences or paragraphs about a reflection on that lesson. How would you advise students actually go about reflecting, student teachers that is, reflecting upon their feedback and just digesting it? We talked about celebrating wins and that sort of thing, but actually just making sense of it all.
I think sometimes it's best to reflect not straight after the lesson, in case, if you think it's, if you think particularly if you think it's not gone as well, it's not always helpful to do it straight after. Equally, you might think it's gone really well, then you go to mark a child's book or children's books and you can see actually they haven't got it at all. Sometimes it's best done like a couple of hours after, or at the end of the day, or during non-contact time, but that you make sure you reflect. I mean, one thing that I always used to do is I would write on my planning. So if I know not all schools require you to provide written planning, but actually like just annotating on anything that went really well or next steps. And I'm not talking about like a full-on essay, but as in like anything that went really well, or just a highlighter and highlight what went really well, what didn't work well, what resource worked really well for certain children, and then thinking about using it again. I mean, I also, as part of my teacher training, had to do like a weekly reflective journal, which I know can be quite common on teacher training, but obviously that is shared with people. But yeah, it's just about finding whatever works for you, whether it be through talking, whether it be through writing or typing or whatever. Find a way to do it. I think it's really important that you do it in some form and that you don't put it off, like, because otherwise, if you're not as reflective, and people have to tell you what you need to work on, it's quite hard when you're on that in that classroom then on your own.
I think one of the things you said there that was really useful is maybe don't do it straight away, because I think because you've almost got that adrenaline high, don't you? As you come out of a lesson, irrespective of how it went, you sort of got heightened hormones or whatever. Your brain's racing, and actually sometimes it takes a bit of time to reflect upon it. Once you've got a bit of distance from that lesson, actually could be a little bit more objective in how you view it.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've talked about an awful lot of things today. We talked about how trainees can get the most out of observing other teachers, watching specific areas of practice, whether it's in their modelling or in their behaviour management, in how they establish routines, and also about how trainee teachers can respond to feedback from more experienced practitioners and what actually those mentors are looking for in sort of priority lists. Is there anything in particular, just in terms of a logistics aspect, that you would do to lay things out? Because I find one of the things that I've tried to do is I've got this book, and yes, I'm looking at timings, but I'm now or something like that, or I've actually drawn a map of the classroom, and I've sort of mapped out where the teacher has walked over the course of the lessons. But I do find just organising all of this information quite complicated, and actually making it useful long term. Otherwise, I'm just writing stuff down, not doing anything with it. So how would you go about doing that?
I mean, I personally, in terms of observation for my own development, have like a notebook that I would just a small A5 notebook that I write it in. I then would either highlight on there from the notes the key things that I want to take away, or write them like separately at the bottom. Obviously, if you're having this conversation with a mentor, they might encourage you to then say, oh, well, what did you get out of that observation? Like, what are you going to take forward, kind of thing. But I think, yeah, either way you find it, you probably find that, say, for example, it's a bit different now that I've observed teachers in terms of for monitoring purposes from a leadership perspective, because I then might record that a little bit more formally, or have a Word document form I'm going to record it on. So it's about finding the way that works for you. And you might find a slightly different way as well. Whatever works for you, as long as you're able to pick out the key threads, then that's the main thing, I think.
Thank you, Ben. It's been a really interesting conversation with you. There's an awful lot here that I need to digest, and maybe I'll go and reflect upon this later on today, just after I've got a little bit distance and I can objectively focus on all this. I really appreciate your time today and everything that you've shared, all your experience, and I really like that you've shared your experiences as a trainee and as an NQT or ECT, because it just helps me to remember that actually my mentor at one point was in my shoes, and that's going to be true for every single teacher. And so I do appreciate that, and that's just really empathetic, I think. Is there anything else you'd just like to share, just as in the closing minute or so of the show?
Nothing really. Just say thank you to you, Sam, for letting me on your show, but also to a huge good luck to all the trainees and early career teachers out there. It is incredibly hard, not just for those of you early in your career, like it is. It's hard for a lot of us in terms of education, but just keep going. You know, every step is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it's a really good note to end on. So, yeah, it is a demanding year, but it is rewarding. And actually, the whole purpose of these classroom observations that we've been talking about is taking those steps forward. Thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciate you giving up your time on a Saturday to talk to me. Hope you have a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Take
Sorry.
care. Sorry. Take care.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.